"Forgive me, Lord, because I knew what I did." The words, written in a hand that trembled but did not falter, stained the fold with the brown of old ink and a single dark smear where a finger had smudged the sentence as if hesitation might erase a lifetime. The paper was found tucked behind a loose tile under the eaves of San Jerónimo, where mice kept their counsels and the rain kept secrets. For years it had lain there, folded to the size of a palm, waiting like a confession that could no longer be trusted to prayer alone. Hacienda San Jerónimo sat on the slope of a river valley, as if someone had set down a large, melancholy house and left it to reckon with its own shadow. The roof tiles wore years like a traveller wears a coat. The barred windows learned to keep out more than thieves. Beyond the house, the land rolled into cane and cacao, and a trapiche that ground its slow, inevitable labour from dawn until dusk. Men and women moved in patterns the way wind learns a ravine, repeating routes, familiar turns, small private rebellions disguised as chores. The colonel's voice carried along those routes like the loose reverberation of a bell, necessary, resented, always keeping time. Beatriz Eugenia de Salazar y Mendoza had been 32 the year the letter was written, and though she appeared to the village to be the very picture of propriety, the colonel's wife, a woman skilled in prayer, needlework, and the management of household accounts, there were places beneath her skin where coal stayed warm and dangerous. She had been married to Rodrigo Cifuentes in the manner of alliances, property exchanged for the consolidation of name and estate, vows made on the lip of convenience rather than in the company of desire. In public, she performed the duties expected of her with an almost austere efficiency. Guests received, charity measured to the smallest noble amount, candles arranged so that shadow always followed light at the correct angle. At night, however, the house held other quiet economies. Rodrigo's presence in the bedchamber was often an event of noise rather than intimacy, the clink of a glass, the scrape of a chair, the heavy inhalation of a man who believed himself the axis of law. His corruption lived in ledgers that lay more in the margins than in the sums, in cacao shipments that never left the property, and in promises made to men who never appeared again. The household counted these losses, as if counting for the colonel's benefit. None outside the immediate circle saw that the ledger and the ledger's silence could be instruments more cruel than whip or chain. The arrival of the new slaves that spring had been ordinary in all its particulars. The creak of the coach, the slit of the gate before the caravan, the heavy boots and dull eye of a man whose limbs had learned to carry weight. They carried them like one carries a crate, by which end is easier to grasp. Among this procession, when Beatrice first lifted her hand from the embroidery she had been ignoring, she saw a pair of eyes that felt like an error in the world, green and startling, like a moss that had found its way into coal. They were not the green of chance jewelry, or the green of foreign fashion. They were the green of a thing that had been watching light for many years and had answered it with the decision to remain. Those eyes belonged to a man whose name, when it was spoken in a list after names, was Mateo. Mateo's hands were quiet and sure. He moved through the hacienda's small offices as if he had already calculated the places of fault and repair. He could count, of course, that was an obvious attribute in a man assigned to accounts, but he also read. He read in the way the mayordomo read the river, not for measure alone, but for the possibility of turning its course. He had learned how to read in the dark by lighting stolen matches and holding a scrap of paper to a candle flame, until the smoke itself taught him where the letters began. The colonel had assumed, like many men in possession of power, that a slave's talents were useful only when they served to increase his yield. He had not noticed that with every ledger Mateo filled, he also filled a different kind of ledger, memory. Beatrice had long grown accustomed to measuring the space between her husband and herself. There were distances that exceeded physical length, the space of honor, of rumor, of the cold code of repute that kept a woman intact but insulated. Mateo's gaze re-entered that architecture and found a seam. It was at one afternoon exercise, when a repaired table collapsed under a tray of cups and Rodrigo scolded the nearest hand, that Beatrice first spoke to the stranger who would later become the center of what she would confess. "Bring me the accounts," she said, but the words had a different address than one would use to a subordinate. They landed like an invitation at Mateo's feet, and his reply was a modest bow of head that accepted the invitation as either directive or recognition, depending on what Beatrice expected of herself. He brought the ledgers with the calm of a man delivering what was expected. The volumes were bound in worn leather, the edges like teeth that had lost their patience. He laid them on the table, and when he opened one, the pages sighed their own small protests. Beatrice watched him work, the way he smoothed the parchment with a sleeve, the tilt of his head when numbers hid behind ink, the small marks he made in a margin as if he were saving a line for a later name. She realized with a sudden lurch that these marks were not only sums, they were accusations. "Did the shipment go?" she asked. Matteo's eyes flicked up, almost shyly, to her face. "It left," he said, "but the sacks did not leave with it." The colonel's mischief was not merely in the disappearing goods. It was in the disappearance being a matter of pride. Rodrigo had taught those around him that men absconded with debt or with cunning, and that it was the natural law of estates. He had also taught that a woman's indignation was like a bell that must be quieted. It was unbecoming for a wife to raise her voice. Beatrice felt a hotness in her chest, the sensation of a bell being rung under her ribs. It was not merely anger, it was a recognition that the house had been built on unpaid labor and hidden theft, that her title and name were ledger entries the colonel used to tidy his transgressions. She began to see herself less as a figure in a carried arrangement and more as an investor of indignation, the sort of holder who could put accusation on paper and turn ledger into law. When Matteo described the way Rodrigo disguised the missing cacao, 3 sacks lost to the river, he did so without flourish. The smallness of his testimony was the very point. He had watched where the colonel's hand slid into the pockets of shipment registers, and he had written down the slips. To say the truth like that in a room where the colonel's name was an instrument of power already carried consequence. To record it was to weaponize memory. Beatrice listened as if she were choosing a blade, not because she had no fear of it, but because she was tired of being afraid. Their conversations multiplied like secret knots. They took place in the hours when servants moved like ghosts, between vespers and the dinner where the colonel laughed the loudest. They took place over the ledger, over pages that Matteo turned with the cadence of a man counting back to freedom. He read entries aloud sometimes, not in accusation but in proof. Dates, amounts, the peculiar cipher of Rodrigo's shorthand. Beatrice found herself leaning closer than she had to any man alive, as if proximity could translate arithmetic into accountability. There were moments, small and charged, when their hands brushed over the paper, and the sensation was not only a spark, but a ledger being balanced, an action that leveled weight. It would be wrong, and the house would have 1,000 tongues to tell it wrong, to call what moved between them merely desire stripped of context. There was a hunger of another sort in Beatrice, a hunger to be used for a cause rather than as an ornament. She had been tired of performing piety that was a practice of erasure, tired of sewing handkerchiefs stained with other people's shame. Matteo, in his quiet competence, presented a mirror in which she recognized a self that could act. In his green eyes there was not only the reflection of her face, but a reflection of possibility. What to do with a ledger that named the colonel's crimes? Matteo, for his part, did not confuse admiration with consent to be exploited. He had been broken in parts and preserved in others. He had seen masters who spoke sweet and acted cruel. He had read names and numbers, and had watched how the law had been trained to ignore those who could not speak it. His intelligence had been a dangerous thing, and he had learned caution as one learns to breathe in dust. He did not offer himself as romantic salvation. He offered what he could. His calculation of risk, the margins of Rodrigo's arrogance, the way the governor's visits came with pageantry and with opportunity. Their alliance began in practical terms. Matteo made a list of shipments, of dates, of men sent away under suspicious claims. Beatrice, who had always known the patterns of hospitality and the geography of scandal, found in those lists the contours of a campaign. The idea was not sudden. It crept in as a thought takes hold, quietly, insistently, until it feels like a voice of reason. They would compile the ledger as evidence. They would wait for an occasion when the colonel's hypocrisy could be made public, and the law, such law as might be persuaded by paper and by the weight of a governor's watchful eye, could be used against him. There were other reasons Beatriz chose to engage beyond the ledger. Rodrigo's cruelty was not only fiscal. He kept company with men who had no reverence for the tender. He held court with gossips and flatterers who spoke of Beatriz in the soft, possessive tones of ownership rather than in any language of love. He had allowed the house to become a clearing where the poor and the enslaved were humiliated for sport. He had punished without conscience. In the quiet of her bedroom, Beatriz could feel the weights of slave wheels turning in the courtyard. She could hear the after-whispers of lashes she refused to name. It was not the sight of Mateo's green eyes that opened her. It was the sight of how those eyes had catalogued indignities and kept them safe as future accusation. Eusebio, the mayordomo, watched their developing arrangement with the wary loyalty of a man who belonged to two worlds. Mulatto himself, he had learned to bend when required and to protect those he trusted. He had served Rodrigo for decades and could list the colonel's sins in a tone so matter-of-fact it made the chapel's prayers sound theatrical. Eusebio slipped Mateo information when he could, smuggling the names of men who had taken orders from Rodrigo and of those who had disappeared into debtor's darkness. He did this in a language of small gestures, a raised eyebrow at the right time, a loaf of bread left on a servant's bench with a folded coin beneath it. He did this because he had seen enough to know that institutions of power would calcify unless someone cracked their shell. "Be careful," he told Beatriz one evening in the kitchen, where the lamb and peppers were cooling on the hearth. "Power is a flood when the bank breaks. People drown who don't know how to swim." Beatriz looked at Eusebio as if measuring the length of his lifetime against the length of her decision. "Do you think I do not know that? Do you think I do not learn to swim alone because I fear the cold?" Eusebio's mouth quivered into something like a smile. "You are not alone if you do not wish it." There were, of course, the dangers of a woman stepping beyond the decorous lines of her sex at San Jerónimo. The church, represented not by a single man, but by the habit and doctrine that had sharpened the community's sense of right, watched women like Beatriz with suspicion. Padre Anselmo would preach the virtues of patience and of submission from the pulpit, and in the privacy of the confessional mark, the sins of women like a ledger of their own. The parish, in its gentle cruelty, kept lists of reputations and sealed them with gossip. A woman who stepped into public action risked being accused of vanity or worse. An entire society ascribed to her the vice of transgressing the order, and for this reason, Beatriz measured her choices against the cost she might be asked to pay. When the first real chance arrived, a governor's journey announced by the sound of trumpets in the valley, and by the arrival of Don Joaquin de la Hoz and his consort, Doña Mercedes, in their carriage of lacquer and petition, Mateo and Beatriz no longer spoke as conspirators, but as partners in a surge of purpose. The governor's visit was an annual ritual, a spectacle of oversight that required colonels to show their ledgers and their faces. It was an occasion made for the performance of power, and such occasions were, for those who understood, also occasions of exposure. Paper was consulted, names were read, men were tested. Rodrigo, who believed himself secure behind the armor of rank and the warmth of the governor's favors, would not suspect the simplicity of the instrument poised by his own hearth. A book, a hand, and the courage of a woman. They prepared as people prepare for a storm. Beatriz rehearsed the face of a wife scorned but resolute. She arranged her dress so that her hands were visible and unembellished, because a woman with bare hands invites trust, despite the scandal she might imply. Mateo fed the ledger with evidence, cross-referencing dates and names as if the document were a weapon. He taught Beatriz quietly how evidence must be presented, not as a cry of vengeance, but as an argument in which numbers and paper outshone rhetoric. There were small intervening moments that tethered them to the human. One night, when the rain had loosened the dust from the courtyard and left it smelling of wet earth and the wool of men, Beatriz found Mateo at the stable, where the lantern's glow turned his eyes into deep coins of green. He was teaching a young boy to trace letters in the dirt. "Why teach him?" Beatriz asked. "It is illegal for them to read." "Illegality makes it valuable," Mateo said with a half-smile, "and usefulness survives on more than law. It survives on teaching." Beatriz sat on a crate nearby and watched the child's fingers make clumsy crosses in the mud. The sight of a small hand given tools rather than nails felt like an offering she wanted to make on a larger altar. She placed her palm against the ledger he had left open on the bench, and in that touch there was the compact of conspiracy: paper, hand, and the decision to act. Matteo did not press himself upon her, as a man might in less justifiable stories. He offered steadiness. Once, when Rodrigo returned unexpectedly and raided the study in a fury born of suspicion and ruined appetite, Matteo stood between the colonel and the ledger, as if a man could become a door. The colonel's voice was a whip made of custom. He called names and insinuations. He demanded explanations. Matteo's calm in that room of heat and lights and the clink of cups read like a refusal to be panicked. He answered only what was asked, and the silence that followed his answers tended to be longer than any mercy Rodrigo could fabricate. It was in that silence that Beatrice made her first deliberate choice. The night after the raid, in the curtained privacy of her chamber, where the moon arranged itself like a verdict across the floor, she took the small piece of paper she had always kept folded behind her prayer book, the one with the blue ribbon, and she wrote a single word: present. She slid it into the ledger so quietly the paper made no sound. Words can be such clumsy instruments for decisions, but Beatrice liked the weight of them when given form. To write was to step something out into the world that could be lifted and displayed for other eyes. She did not pretend it was merely a confession of love. The paper was both confession and summons. It tied together the motifs that had come to govern her days: the ledger, the green-eyed witness, the blue ribbon she kept in her hair as if to mark a place in time. Matteo, when she revealed her act, did not smile with joy. He looked at her as if reading the future in the ink. "You know what this will cost," he said. "I know," she replied. The word was not delivered with fearlessness. It was a careful tally. "I choose it." Choice, in Beatrice's mind, was not an act of surrender to the body alone. It was an exercise in moral arithmetic. She understood all too well the possible punishments: the church's rebuke, the neighborhood's scorn, the possibility that the vire himself, lending weight to custom over compassion, might take the side of power. She understood how precarious their position would be, but she also understood that maintaining silence would be to be complicit in the colonel's theft and cruelty. To live with that knowledge was to become another clerk in a corrupt office. She would not. They settled into the peculiar rhythm of two conspirators, one writing, one remembering, both willing to hold the ledger up before men who believed themselves immune to scrutiny. They practiced restraint in public and defiance in private. They learned that a touch could signal a page turned, that a particular look across the chapel could mean the name to be read aloud when the governor called upon them. The ledger became their liturgy. Not all in the house approved or could be trusted. Dr. Ignacio Sarmiento, who tended to Rodrigo's fevers and to his appetite for flattery, hovered at the edge of suspicion. He loved the smells of fine tobacco and the way privilege wrapped around a man. He had never been a moralist in the sober sense, but he was practical. He observed Matteo with a clinical curiosity that was not entirely unkind, but his loyalty belonged to the colonel's comfort. Padre Anselmo, more troubled by order than by truth, kept his counsel measured and his sermons measured to the beat of votes at the next parish meeting. Rumor, like fertilizer, accelerates growth in the wrong season. Guests arrived to watch the theater of the governor's visit, and in small private acts the household prepared for the performance of justice. Servants whispered in the laundry, children learned names by repetition, and the field hands measured their steps to keep them from appearing conspicuous. Beatrice moved through this preparation with the grave intent of a woman who has made a vow not only to herself, but to those she could no longer deny. On the morning the carriage was to arrive, the valley woke slow and metallic. A mist laced the river, and the smell of coffee mingled with the dampness of the earth. The trumpet that announced Don Joaquin's approach sounded like an omen. The horses' hoofs were the punctuation of a sentence that all of San Jerónimo felt they had written. The colonel dressed himself in a uniform embroidered with the bones of his reputation, and he walked the halls with the stride of a man who trusts his own narrative. Beatrice tied the blue ribbon in her hair, as if anchoring herself to the decision she had made. She slipped the ledger into a drawer of the escritoire where it would not be suspected. She also tucked the small folded confession behind the prayer book in the same drawer. so that if the law of this land required the confession of a woman, she would be the one to offer it. The ribbon seemed ridiculous and necessary at once, a small color against a world of browns and griefs. Matteo stood at the threshold as the carriage rounded the last bend. For the first time since they had started their calculus, both of them felt the weight of an audience that would not be kindness to weigh. He placed a quiet hand on her wrist, and the gesture, as always, asked nothing more than presence. When she looked at him, she saw in his face the arithmetic of their plan. The ledger would speak. The colonel might not be able to answer. The governor might be compelled by his own conscience or by the spectacle of evidence to act. Alternatively, the colonel might be secure, the governor distracted, the law pliant to the side of the powerful. These were the two columns of possibility. They balanced like scales, uncertain and waiting. The house gathered itself, as any house does, when it knows a decision is afoot. Servants lined the stair. The chapel bells chimed not for a wedding, but for a visitation of power. Rodrigo descended the steps with the authority of someone accustomed to being believed. He did not, as many men do, anticipate the pages that had been turned in secret. For him, the ledger was a tool to calibrate the wages of fear and favor. He had no expectation of being undone by a mere book. Beatrice walked toward the reception room with the slow, precise step of a woman who intends to be seen. She had arranged her face to be severe, but not cruel, resigned but not broken. She had learned that a woman in public accusation must present a composure that some men mistake for innocence. They have a weakness for it, and it gives them opportunities to see themselves as reasonable persecutors. Don Joaquin de la Hoz stepped from his carriage like a man who expected to be entertained by the rituals of authority. His companion, Doña Mercedes, wore the sort of discreet finery that made power seem like a luxury rather than an obligation. The household performed its role well. The door opened, the courtesy exchanged, the speeches made in soft, civil tones. The governor took his seat at the long table, where the colonel had displayed profits and charts, and where, in the civility of officialdom, men measured each other's consciences as if they were currency. When it came to the presentation of accounts, the colonel spoke at such length that even the governor's patience found itself taxed. He waxed on about revenues and moral hazards and the noble burdens of stewardship. He performed the sacrifice and the necessity in the same breath. Around the table, men nodded in the way of those who profit from repetition. The ledger was an actor in the room. It had been placed upon a side table like a prop. Beatrice felt the heat of the room and a sudden clarity. The hearing would be brief, and evidence must be precise. She rose when Rodrigo finished speaking, and without the flourish of a woman meant only to be decorative, she requested the governor's indulgence to present a paper. The act itself was a kind of defiance, not a shout, but a submission of fact. The paper was the ledger Matteo had prepared. The confession, tied with the blue ribbon, remained behind her prayer book, in case the house demanded the theatrics of contrition instead of the stubborn fact of evidence. Matteo watched as she spoke. He did not speak for her. He had taught her to use her voice as if it were a blade honed on logic rather than passion. And when she unfolded the ledger and read aloud the entries he had copied, the room inhaled, as if given a new instruction on justice. Rodrigo's face shifted from confidence to the thinness of a man who is being measured by standards he expected to bend. The colonel moved then, like a man whose pride had been prodded. He denied, he accused, he called names that were meant to shame. He called on relationships and favors, on the governor's goodwill, and on the long river of custom that had always protected men like him. He spared no vitriol in his speeches. Yet the ledger, with its patient ink, did not shame in the tone of the pulpit. It argued with the authority of what had been recorded, and records have a stubbornness that makes them companions to those who seek the truth. Matteo remained in the corner, as if he had nothing to do with the proceedings, but his presence was a mark the colonel had not anticipated. A man who could name the thefts, who could prove by cross-entries and shipping lists the missing sacks, the payments rendered to non-existent merchants, the money routed through shadow accounts. It was not merely accusation. It was proof that could be verified by the governor's audits if he desired. In that moment, with the governor poised between courtesy and duty, Beatrice felt the consequences of her action settle around her like a cloak. She risked forever the small, steady life of appearances. She risked exile, scorn, the possibility that her child, if she would ever have one, might be marked by rumor. She also felt the odd lightness that occurs when a woman chooses who she will be, rather than who others require her to be. Her hands did not tremble now. They held the ledger with the exactitude of someone who had been balancing the books of her conscience for too long. The governor raised his hands, and the room leaned toward him as if toward an altar. He read. The entries did not plead, they stated. He turned the pages with the quiet formality of a magistrate who was weighing a decision that had not before been laid so plainly at his feet in a house where dignity had long immunized wrong. Around him, the chamber held its breath. Outside, beyond the house, the valley continued to work and wait. When the governor finally spoke, he did so not with a pronouncement, but with the thin professionalism of a man who understood the difference between scandal and legal inquiry. These are serious charges, he said. They shall be examined. It was not the thunder Beatrice had feared. It was not the immediate retribution she imagined, nor the naive triumph she had sometimes allowed herself in secret. It was, rather, the beginning of a process that would be both political and brutal. The colonel, for his part, grew pale and spoke certain words that sounded like promises to redress everything should the evidence be found faulty. His arrogance had been shaken, but not yet shattered. He would, in the days that followed, move the instruments of power in his favor. Phone calls, favors, threats rendered always with the polish of a man who believed that influence could rewrite facts. And yet the ledger had been opened. The colonel's hands, those hands that had long reached into the pockets of others, now had to reach for defense. The guard at the door stood like an implication. Beatrice, who had acted with the measured cruelty of someone who is tired of excuses, felt the first gust of the winds she had stirred. The house, which had seemed a static thing for decades, began to change its shape. After the governor left, softened by the decorations of his visit, but carrying with him papers and impressions, Beatrice and Matteo stood in the emptied room like people who had just closed a difficult contract. They had not yet sung victory. They had, at best, initiated a negotiation with a beast that wore law as armor. "Do you regret it?" Matteo asked quietly, his voice resembling the ledger's rustle. Beatrice considered the question. There was no regret in her mind as to the decision itself, only an accounting of consequences to be made. "Regret is for those who avoid consequence," she said. "I have decided that some debts must be called and collected." Matteo nodded. He was pleased not because he liked confrontation, but because clarity of purpose is a currency of its own. "Then we must be ready," he said. "He will not give up easily." They began to prepare for the days to come. Matteo fortified the ledger with copies tucked in secret places. Beatrice confided in Eusebio some of their plans and rehearsed her face for the scrutiny of neighbors and church. There were whispers already in the kitchen of San Jerónimo. The colonel, once secure, moved like a man with new tremors. Doctor Ignacio kept his distance, as if the rub of scandal dirtied his white coats. Padre Anselmo watched the congregation with new intensity, as if sin had suddenly become a matter of gossip rather than of sacrament. Beatrice felt watched not only by men in sudden suspicion, but by her own conscience, which ledgered itself in ways she had not expected. There were nights when she held the confession letter and read the first line aloud to herself, as if reminding God of the decision she had made. "Forgive me, Lord, because I knew what I did." The phrasing was not an admission of ignorance, but of knowledge. She had acted with the full understanding of the cost. There was dignity in that acknowledgement. It was a kind of prayer. The first standoff after the governor's visit occurred 3 weeks later, when Rodrigo accused Matteo in front of the servants of listening, where he had no right to listen, of reading paper that was not his to read. He struck the man across the face, not with the fierce cruelty of a beast, but with the calculated humiliation of a man who wished to reassert dominance in public ritual. The blow, though not savage in its force, was severe in its implication. The colonel intended to signal that challenging him would be to invite the lash of social ostracism as well as physical punishment. Matteo's hand rose to his cheek, and in that small gesture there was no flinch. He steadied himself and replied with calmness that was edged with an intelligence Rodrigo could not pass. He spoke of orders and duty, of the habit of record and of proof. Rodrigo's voice filled the room like a thunderclap, meant to scatter birds. Some of the servants flinched, some looked away. Eusebio, who had witnessed 100 storms in the house, moved closer to Matteo with the protective instinct of someone who had his own ledger of grudges. Beatrice stepped between them, as if her body could be another ledger entry that reminded her husband of the social codes he might yet respect. Her act was not a pleading, it was an assertion. "You have no right to treat him thus," she said plainly. Rodrigo's reply was a snarl of ownership. "He is my property," he spat. "It is your property to command," Beatrice answered, "but you are not property to rule as you wish. There are limits marked by law and by honor." Those words were transgressive enough to begin the whispering chorus anew. The colonel, who had built his empire on the complacency of townsfolk and the silent acquiescence of the church, now faced a wife who had learned to hold the ledger as her shield. He retreated to his study that afternoon with a look like a man who had just been told of an approaching storm but had not yet identified its source. The house would not be the same after that day. There were small rebellions, a servant who refused an order and found work in another hacienda, a foreman who took a new master because the old one smelled of corruption. People who had only ever registered themselves as property began slowly to imagine themselves as bearers of a story that could be told aloud. It was the smallest miracle. When a ledger is opened, history can be read by more than one pair of eyes. Yet the danger accumulated like storm clouds beyond the bend of the river. The colonel had friends in the provincial circles. He had made gifts and purchased loyalties with both coin and insinuation. If he could not refute the ledger's numbers, he would attempt to neutralize the women who brought them forward. A wife's reputation could be ruined, a man's testimony discredited. In a place where reputation was a coin as precious as gold, the colonel still had reserves. That night, before sleep took her, Beatrice took up the letter again. The blue ribbon caught the moonlight and sent back a small, conspicuous color into the dim. She had not yet written the full confession she would eventually tuck beneath a tile. There were paragraphs that would not be honest until the outcome of their labors could be measured. But she could write in the hushed confessional mood of the house the truth she understood now. That love, and if such a thing had grown between her and Matteo, was not the fulcrum of her choice. It was merely the human proof that two people, seeing the ledger for what it was, could choose to act in concert. She closed the prayer book and tied the blue ribbon around it like a vow. Outside, the hacienda breathed and shifted in its slow, surly way. The river below carried away husks and rumors, some to be swallowed by the ocean and others to be deposited into the mouths of new listeners. In the corner of the room, Matteo had placed one of the ledger's copies, small, handwritten, precise, and light from the dying candle turned the green of his eyes into two small conspiracies of color. He and Beatrice had entered together into a covenant that would cost both of them. There was no melodrama in the way they spoke of their future. There was only readiness. Readiness has a particular look. Not triumph, not despair, but the quiet, fixed appetite of those poised to do what they believe is right. When Rodrigo finally left his study for the chapel, carrying the weight of a man who felt himself besieged yet still mighty, Beatrice took the fold of paper from behind the prayer book and smoothed it between her fingers. She placed it in the hollow of the wall beneath the tiles, not as a hiding place, but as a witness. The house kept things. It registered lives and sins in mortar and timber. She considered then the line she had begun with, and in the hush she added more, as if the house might be an ear that would pass her words on. She wrote, "Forgive me, Lord, because I knew what I did." Then beneath that, in a hand steadier than the first, she wrote, "I chose." Their plan would unfold in the days to come like the turning of pages. There would be a governor's inquiry, of course, and men in powdered wigs whispering commerce disguised as virtue. There would be the colonel's attempts to buy favor and to intimidate by the subtle cruelty of small men. There would also be friends and betrayals and the slow, grinding cruelty of institutions that prefer their own coherence to justice. But for the first time in her life, Beatrice had set her own name beside a ledger and weighed it. The scale did not promise happiness. It offered the only thing she wished for, the consequence appropriate to the truth she had chosen to proclaim. At dawn the next morning, the valley brighter and sharper than before, a messenger arrived in haste with news from the 11-mile road. A rider had come bearing letters, and in the letters there were names and an edict that had not been expected. People at San Jerónimo gathered at the gate like a chorus summoned before a new scene. The ledger remained in its place. At dawn the next morning, the valley bright and hard as a coin, a rider arrived with papers bound in a ribbon of official red, and the kind of breathless urgency that comes from men who have been asked to move history. The messenger dismounted at the gate and handed the colonel a stack of seals and a short, crisp order. The governor required a temporary detainment pending further inquiry. Inspectors would be sent, accounts would be sealed until the truth could be established. The language was careful, but the action it demanded was clear. San Jerónimo, for the first time in memory, was given instructions it could not bend. The news moved through the house like a frost. Rodrigo read the order at least twice, then laughed, the sound brittle as if made of glass. His friends would be called, his letters would be read, his favors would be counted. Men like him valued process when it confirmed them and feared it when it turned the page on their appetite. Yet the order had arrived with a governor's signature. The colonel's usual remedies, a purse, a favor, a whispered threat, found less purchase in paper than in person. That paper, Mateo knew and Beatrice knew, played a different role than the colonel's silver. It was not a thing to be bought. For 3 days the hacienda held its breath. Inspectors came and went in sober jackets. They smelled faintly of ink and city wood smoke. They opened trunks and pressed fingers along ledgers, as a priest might press thumbs to a sinner's pulse. They asked questions in ways that were both procedural and designed to unsettle. Where had sacks of cacao gone? Who had signed for cash that never left the safe? They were careful to avoid spectacle even while they manufactured it. The law, Mateo taught Beatrice, prized the appearance of impartiality like men prized their coats. Rodrigo responded with the violence of one who has been toppled from a throne. He called meetings with men who owed him and men who feared him. He sought out Don Joaquin with new flattery. He invited Dr. Ignacio to dine and to offer him testimony of character. He asked Padre Anselmo to counsel the household on the proprieties of patience. He wrote letters that smelled faintly of perfumed paper and threatened the reputations of those who might give testimony unfavorably. His voice became the voice of a man clambering to hold a rope thrown to him by men who had once admired him. It was a foolish sound in the face of public ledger. And yet he had advantages that could not be counted only in coin. Reputation is a currency the law is loath to disrupt without insistence. Men in the province preferred stability to scandal. They favored the colonel's comfortable myths, because myths allowed their own fortunes to remain intact. The governor, who had not wished for entanglement, was now obliged to choose whether to look closely and risk the displeasure of the powerful, or to fold the matter into the soft folder of compromise. Beatrice felt this political gravity like cold pressing into her shoulders. She also felt the thin flame of resolve. When the inspectors finished their work, they took a copy of Mateo's ledger and left with the promise of report. For a week the valley waited for the governor's verdict, as one waits for a storm to either break or pass. In the meantime, Rodrigo's acts grew more reckless. He accused servants of theft to frighten potential witnesses. He browbeat a foreman into silence by threatening to ruin his family. He arranged for a small party of men from a nearby hacienda to come for dinner and laugh with him in the way of conspirators. He thought that if the world could be made jolly again, the ledger would seem an absurd interruption. On a late afternoon, when heat slanted like a blade and the sky was a tired blue, carriage wheels announced that the governor had returned with quicker action than expected. This time he did not arrive alone. A small retinue followed, and behind him rode a notary and 2 aides who carried the air of official consequence. He requested a private audience with Rodrigo and with Beatrice. The colonel, flushed with the panic of a man who tries to make strength look like confidence, protested, but could not forestall the governor's temperate insistence. The house arranged itself as if for a court. In the study, amid shelves that smelled faintly of cigar and old paper, the governor read the ledger that Mateo had prepared. He read aloud entries that matched shipping manifests, that traced payments to obscure merchants and deposits into accounts that led away from the hacienda and into the colonel's pocket. The practice of reading was itself a form of judgment, each line a small hammer that tested the colonel's story for sound. Beatrice sat at the edge of the room like someone witnessing the counting of her own debts and gains. Rodrigo, when he was finally put to word, made his defense the only way men of his sort know how, with swells of indignation, with memories of service, with the practiced turning of sin into stereotype. He called witnesses, he offered gifts, and he tried to inveigle the governor with stories of the social good he claimed to have done. But when the ledger was set beside his pleas, it made a sharper case than his words. There were cross-references and bills, ferry receipts and signatures that had been forged under the pressure of his handwriting. The notary tapped the ledger with a pen, as if consulting an oracle. The governor, a man more comfortable with protocol than with cruelty, made a decision that startled the household. Rodrigo would be detained while the investigations continued. The hacienda's management, for the moment, would be overseen by an interim committee under the governor's direction. It was a quiet kind of seizure. The house did not erupt like a storm, but the colonel's life was circled and constrained. He was led away with the dignity of a man who had been taught to hold his chin high, even as he was shown a cell. The servants watched, some with pity and others with relief. Eusebio, who had expected trouble but had not been given permission to hope, let his shoulders ease for the first time in months. In the strange hollow that follows such upheaval, Beatrice found herself called before the notary and the governor with an unexpected proposition. Would she assume legal title to San Jerónimo? The practice was not unprecedented. In cases where a husband stood accused, property could fall under the nominal stewardship of the wife, especially if the governor wished to keep plantations running and reduce the risk of violent reprisals. The governor framed it as a temporary measure until the inquiry concluded. He spoke of duty and caretaking, of the house's need for continuity. Yet under his breath, and in the notary's careful eyes, there was the knowledge that he had created a rupture in the colonel's domination. Beatrice heard the offer as if from a room apart. The idea of legal ownership tasted of iron and of possibility. It placed her in an odd position of power, a power she had learned to wield in the ledger's shadow, but never imagined could be hers in the full public light. She also understood the trap. To accept would be to step further into the storm she had begun summoning. To refuse would be to surrender an opening that might allow Rodrigo to restore his reign. She weighed the decision as she had learned to weigh all things, ledger against conscience, cost against consequence. "I will take it," she said finally, speaking in a voice that had the clarity of arithmetic. "If the governor would have me, I will run San Jerónimo." The notary wrote the transfer with the slow gravity of a man who inks a person's name into history. The papers were signed, names laid down, and for a brief and dizzy moment, Beatrice felt something like vertigo. The estate's stones and roofs felt suddenly like a responsibility she would carry alone. To be owner was not only to hold property, it was to hold people, their safety, their labor, their futures. She considered the weight and slipped a small precaution under the tongue of her lips. The manumission would be drawn and signed, and Matteo, whose hands had written the ledger and whose eyes had watched the light, would be given his freedom. Matteo, when the idea was presented, received it with a brief contained joy that did not need to be loud. He understood what such a document could mean in a world where a piece of paper often separated a man from the lash. He accepted the manumission not as an end of his struggle, but as a new beginning that required urgent decisions. "Freedom," he said, "is an opening, not a harbor." Beatrice made the manumission deliberately public. She summoned the household to the great hall, and with the notary present, read the document aloud. It was a dry sheet of legal naming, but the act was ceremonial enough to make the house quake. She handed the signed paper to Matteo with both hands. The gesture was not theatrical but solemn, as if passing a chalice. The moment did not dissolve into applause. It was too raw for that. Instead, there were pointed looks, some of gratitude, others of fury. Padre Anselmo watched with the expression of a man who keeps the moral books balanced and disapproves of any shift that upsets his own calculations. In the weeks that followed, San Jerónimo changed under Beatrice's hand in ways both practical and symbolic. She ordered the fairer distribution of rations. She insisted that children of the workers be given lessons in letters and numbers when possible. She questioned overseers who practiced cruelty in the language of efficiency. Matteo, freed yet not naive, took to the role of steward and teacher with the quiet energy of a man who had learned to shape the small liberties he could secure. He trained a few chosen hands to keep accounts properly. He began to keep a list of names that had been erased from the colonel's books. They did not, either of them, pretend that the house had become a utopia. The institution of slavery was still a wound visible in the land and in the law. Some of those owned by neighboring estates refused to take their freedom in exchange for being judged by a court that had so often sided against them. Others eyed San Jerónimo with a wary hope. Markets ostracized the estate in subtle ways. Merchants delayed shipments, buyers offered lower prices, and private lenders pushed back. The colonel's allies tightened a neck of commerce around them as effectively as any legal decree. The church, too, lent its weight to the rumor machine. Padre Anselmo preached cautions about social disorder, about women who overstepped the bounds of domesticity. Yet there was something in the air that had not existed before, a small, stubborn flourishing of instruction. Matteo began to teach letters in the stable and in the lofts where men could not be easily watched. He taught names and sums in the dirt to children who had never known that letters could be instruments of power. He would carve an alphabet on a piece of wood and make their small fingers follow the shapes until the letters felt not like forbidden spoils, but like tools. Beatrice watched Matteo with a tenderness that was not only of the heart. There were evenings when they would sit together over the same ledger, and she would feel a closeness that had the patient strength of two people who had chosen complicity over contract. They kept their intimacy quiet for the sake of prudence, a hand on a sleeve, a finger marking a line on a page, a look across the chapel that said more than a whispered phrase. They loved, insofar as two people can love in a house under surveillance, with an intensity that acknowledged cost and consequence. When she finally understood her body was with child, she did not hide the knowledge because she meant to hide her actions. She received it as another ledger entry, a life added to the tallies of hope and peril. Rodrigo, from his temporary confinement, responded to this new order with the ugliness of wounded pride. He maneuvered through the channels he still had access to, the network of men who believed their fortunes rested on his continued authority. He petitioned the governor. He wrote to the vice-regal courts. He sent emissaries to the capital to whisper that his arrest had been the result of a woman's spite and a slave's cunning rather than of fact. He appealed to tradition and to the fear of social collapse. He argued that the transfer of property to a woman who had shown improper sympathies would unsettle every manor in the province. Those appeals found an audience. The vice-regal seat, eager to maintain order and wary of bold examples that might embolden servants elsewhere, sent an envoy whose first act was to measure the political cost of allowing Beatrice's reforms to stand. It was not that justice was undesired, it was that the machinery of empire preferred neat categories. A free black man elevated in status by a woman who had disrupted the natural order could become, in the eyes of officials, a dangerous precedent. When the Vires decree arrived, it was wrapped not merely in petitions but in the voice of empire. The letter was terse. The transfer of San Jerónimo to Beatrice would remain provisional. Further, the manumission of Matteo would be subject to review, and, as a precautionary measure, the vice-regal authority reserved the right to confiscate estates deemed to threaten public order. The decree was couched in administrative language, but its effect was clear. The center of power had moved against them. The outbreak of fear was immediate. Merchants, sensing the vice-regal hand, redrew their terms. The bishop's curates began to speak in terms that erased the names of those who resisted. Neighbors who had been polite, but distant, suddenly withdrew. Padre Anselmo preached a sermon about the dangers of pride and the virtuousness of submission that seemed pointed enough to sting Beatrice where she lived. There came a night, months later, when soldiers arrived with a writ to execute the Vires decree. They came not to seize the colonel. He was in a distant cell, having been moved for his own safety, but to take possession of the hacienda in the name of the crown. They offered a brief list. Inventories would be removed. Children of questionable status might be taken for placement. The estate's management would be reassigned to a commissary. Their language was sober, yet their presence made the air of the house crack like a thin glass. Beatrice argued with a steadiness that surprised even those who knew her best. She met the officers at the gate and insisted that the manumission had been signed before the confiscation order and that Matteo's status must be respected. Legalists were called, papers were produced and compared. The soldiers, trained to obey and to avoid unnecessary confrontation, read lines and followed orders. Yet behind the paperwork was an agenda the colonel's allies had coaxed. The desire to remove the child, which they styled as careful reassignment for education and social stability. Matteo understood the danger in the way a man understands the wind. It does not always blow where you want it to. He had spent months making plans for contingencies. There were safe routes to the coast, to Cartagena, and friends among traders who might take him on as a hand for passage. He had counted hours and marked names. He had placed a small fund in the hands of Eusebio and had arranged for a skipper who owed him a favor to be at the river by a certain night. The child, their child, whose skin held in it the collision of two worlds, was a risk they could not, by legal argument alone, keep from being passed as a problem. When the order came for the child's removal, Beatrice refused. She stood like a pillar in the doorway of the nursery and invoked every plea that remained: the mother's claim, the sanctity of the household, the timing of the maternity. Men in powdered vests argued that the vice-regal decree permitted such an action in the name of social good. They spoke of propriety and of the dangers of allowing an example to remain. The language was soft, the motives were not. It was in that night of threats and bargaining that Beatrice made the most excruciating of choices. She could attempt to flee with the child, to take refuge in the mountains and live the life of fugitives. She could attempt to bargain further and force the Vire's officers to delay, or she could stay and face the institutions that would most surely punish her with incarceration or exile. Matteo, who had planned escape routes and lined up boats, offered to take the child and go. He would leave her behind with a promise. He would raise the boy to be taught and to remember. He would return if it were safe. Beatrice held his hands and felt in them the ledger's tilt of trust. "I will not run," she said finally, pressing the blue ribbon she had kept now to the child's small hand. "If they take me, at least I will be the one who kept watch here." Matteo's face closed like a book. He had expected courage. He had not expected the depth of this particular kind. He had prepared for separation as a practical step, but the moral calculus of leaving Beatrice in the place she had chosen had been the kind of calculation that did not make him sleep. He kissed the child's forehead with a quick, fierce tenderness and then folded himself into the quiet work of leaving. That night, under the fingered moon, Matteo fled with the infant. Eusebio guided him to a small skiff hidden beneath the reeds by the riverbank. Traders who knew the ways of risk took him on as a deckhand, and the boat slipped away into the dark with the hush of oars on water. They headed for Cartagena, a city where the sea swallowed names, but where freedom had different shapes. Matteo promised himself that he would find a way to return, to make a life for the boy that kept alive the memory of those who had risked. Beatrice watched the skiff vanish and felt the world rearrange. She was left with the officers and their papers, and with a conviction that would not bend. Her refusal to flee became, in the gossip that followed, a demonstration of both bravery and obstinacy. It made her a scapegoat for some, a saintly figure to others. But the law had been given an instrument by which to punish her: the Church. Padre Anselmo, whose sympathies had always leaned toward order, now presented her case as one of morals gone awry. To the conservative ear, her acceptance of stewardship and her association with a freed man suggested scandal. The bishopric, eager not to be seen as soft on social disorder, lent its weight to a recommendation. Beatrice should be removed from public life and placed in a convent for the remainder of her natural days, a decision couched in language of penance and protection. The term protection in such contexts often wears like a shackle. The proceeding that followed was less a formal trial than a performance of social discipline. The notary wrote in his neat script a sentence that would stand for decades. In the interest of order and moral rehabilitation, Doña Beatriz Eugenia de Salazar y Mendoza was committed to the convent of Santa Clara for a period to be determined by ecclesiastical authority. The language left a brittle taste in her mouth. She had chosen to stay, she had said, to keep watch. The watch, it seemed, meant being sacrificial in the calculus of order. On the morning the soldiers and clerics came to take her, the house was filled with the small sounds of unravelling. A spoon left in a basin, a child's blanket flung carelessly over a chest, a ledger left open on a desk. Beatrice dressed herself not to make a statement, but to keep a piece of dignity. A simple dress, the blue ribbon tucked inside her hand. Padre Anselmo read the ritual words, with a voice that seemed to tremble with justification. Women from nearby houses came to stand at a distance, faces lined with curiosity and the particular coldness of neighbors who love scandal where it confirms their own prudence. She walked to the convent with a steadiness that matched the ledger's slow music. At the gate, the prioress took her by the wrist and led her into the cool stone rooms and explanations that had become the fate of many women who had challenged their assigned places. Beatrice felt the world closing like a book, yet even within the convent's walls she kept a stubbornness in her posture. The house could take her body, but she had the ledger of her life written in a different ink. The soldiers executed the Vire's decree on San Jerónimo. They took inventories and transferred title to a commissary appointed by the crown. Some items were returned to the manor's coffers, others were sold to settle supposed arrears. The child was categorized and recorded in an official list before being placed under the temporary care of a distant relation of Doña Mercedes, who would swear publicly to keep the boy's upbringing within the bounds of propriety. San Jerónimo, stripped of its owner and of the home of its chosen steward, no longer stood as a place where reforms could be nurtured. Mateo, in Cartagena, learned of the confiscation through the network of sailors and traders who carried news like ballast. He held the infant to his chest and felt the boy's breath as if it were a small prayer. He taught him to trace letters in the sand and to say the names of men who had given him kindness. He took the child to small schools that allowed him to work in exchange for lessons. The boy grew in the shadow of coral walls and cathedral bells that rang for many masters. Beatrice's punishment in the convent was severe in its social effect, though not necessarily violent in its physical imposition. She was required to perform labors and to keep silence in the way that institutions dictated penance. Yet she was not left without ways of resistance. She wrote when she could, folding letters and hiding them in seams and under tiles. She prayed in ways that read like ledger entries, petitions, and witness. In the privacy of her room, she sewed bits of blue ribbon into the hems of a robe and kept a small portion of the child's blanket folded in a drawer. Her confession letter, the one that began with the line she had written beneath a moon some months before, she tucked again beneath a loose tile near the eaves of the convent's kitchen. The house would not be San Jerónimo, but the language of her choice needed a hiding place. Years passed with the slow cruelty of seasons. San Jerónimo, abandoned and mismanaged by administrators more interested in profit than in people, fell into disrepair. The commissary extracted what he could and left the rest to the weather. Neighbors took what they could and made new bargains. When revolts of laborers rose elsewhere in the province, San Jerónimo was often cited in the lists as a cautionary tale. Do not presume reforms can escape the attention of power. The house that had once been a ledger of lives became a ledger of ruin. Mateo, in the port city, built a lifelike one, constructs a boat, piece by piece, with thrift and with memory. He worked on ships, learned routes, and slowly earned enough to open a small room where he taught children for coin or for food. He called the boy Mateo after himself, and he taught him from the earliest hours to write with a clear hand. He insisted that every child learn to read the names of those who had acted on their behalf and to keep a ledger of their own small deeds. In the dusty classrooms and the homes of fishermen, he became known as a man who taught the poor and who never once shied from telling them the truth about where he had come from. He spoke of chains and of the ledger, and of a woman who had chosen. Mateo Jr. grew into a man who would not forget the stories of names and debts. He learned languages by the light of oil lamps, and walked the city with the rusty pride of one who knows his parents' humility. He became a teacher, not for the fame of it, but because he saw instruction as an act of survival. He taught the children to form letters, then to read, then to count, and finally to ask questions that would make men in authority uncomfortable. He kept a small secret bundle of papers wrapped in oilcloth that his father had given him, copies of the original ledger, small lists of names that should not be forgotten, and one verbatim line that his father repeated to him at night. "Remember who gave you the pen." Years later, when Matteo Jr. was a man with a soft beard and a hand steady enough to write in chalk upon a board, he received a small, unexpected letter. It was written by a woman he did not know, a prioress from a convent whose ear had been touched by mercy, who wrote that an old tile from a certain hacienda had come to them with a paper wrapped beneath it. The note inside had been found during some renovation of convent walls. It had the blue ribbon, brittle as a dried flower, and a line of ink. The letter was transported to Cartagena in a small, careful hand. Matteo Jr., who had been busy teaching boys to add and to dream, took the paper in the dim lamplight and unfolded it. The handwriting was familiar in its humanity, though not in its exact phrasing. He read the line that had opened a life and closed another. "Forgive me, Lord, because I knew what I did." Beneath it was another line in a steadier hand that said simply, "I chose." He sat in the chair by the window and felt the warmth of the past like coals. Around him his students made their small noises and shaped their letters in the sand. He did not read the note aloud as an accusation or a confession. He read it as a map. It told him not only what had been lost but what had been given. He tucked the paper into the bundle his father had given him and set it in a drawer where he kept the names of those he intended to teach about, the ledger of memory. In the years that followed, Matteo Jr.'s classroom became, improbably, a place for memory and for small reparations. He taught boys whose names would be written in official records and those who would be kept off the lists. He insisted that every child learn to sign his name so that no one would be able to erase him again with the convenience of pen. He told the story of a woman who had chosen to stand against a man of power, of a green-eyed clerk who had turned a ledger into a weapon, and of a little boy who had been carried away on a skiff toward a future the house had not wanted to admit. When he spoke of his mother, Matteo Jr. did not use the language of romantic heroism nor the rhetoric of martyrdom. He spoke softly and with the complexity the story deserved. She had loved, she had acted, she had paid a price that was not merely punishment, but also a guarantee that something of their names would survive. He taught the children that the ledger is not merely a record of losses, but also a map of where accounts may yet be made right. Years later still, in a dusk when the city bells called men to supper and the sea sent a smell like iron and salt, a student asked Matteo Jr. a question that had been asked of many before. What would you have done, the student wanted to know, had you been there in that house when the ledger was opened? Would you have chosen safety or freedom? Matteo Jr. thought of the blue ribbon and of a small hand that had once been tucked into Matteo's palm on a river. He thought of a woman who had placed paper beneath tile and who had given up a house to keep a child alive. He thought of the classroom where he taught the children to sign their names and of the way letters can be instruments of hope. He did not offer a simple answer. "I do not know," he said finally, and the admission was itself a kind of honesty. "I know only that someone chose, and because someone chose, we have a paper to read and a child to remember. That is enough to teach us that choices matter." The students nodded as if understanding a small part of a large thing. They went back to their letters and their sums, and Matteo Jr. laid the old paper on the table beside a candle. Its edges were browned and tender. The ink had faded in places, but was stubborn enough to remain legible. He touched the blue ribbon with a finger and felt the weight of the past as a kind of investment. In San Jerónimo, the house had been pulled down over years of neglect. The clay tiles slipped into the earth and were claimed by the river. A new generation farmed the land with different instruments and different tolerances. The ledger, for a long time, had been scattered, pages in trunks, margins stolen by curious children, a copy hidden in a sailor's chest. But the memory persisted in small acts. The children taught to read, the man who taught in a city built by the labor of many, the letters that refused to be erased. The confession letter that had begun this long accounting, "Forgive me, Lord, because I knew what I did," was now folded into a bundle that Matteo Jr. sometimes took from its place to show those who came to learn. He did not use it to make saints or criminals. He used it to show that choices carve history and that memory is a ledger that must be tended. He taught the children to write their names under the line he read to them, and he told them, with the patience of a man who had walked from riverbank to schoolroom, that to write is to make a claim on the world. When the last of the candles had burned and the children had gone back to their homes, Mateo Jr. sat at the small desk and wrote, "For my mother, that someone would remember." He folded the note and laid it beneath the stack of old papers. Outside, the harbor breathed and the night unfolded. In his hand, the blue ribbon, once tucked into a prayer book, felt like a thread that had bound things together. The ledger turned another page, and the names continued. The consequences of those choices, love, loss, exile, teaching, remained written in the lives of men and women who had lived with the cost of daring to dissent. Would you have chosen safety or freedom? Share your thoughts below.